mean, no one is really that excited about Gavin Newsom. So even the people who are opposed to the recall are sort of tepidly opposed. So we think that the voter turnout will actually be favorable as well. Now, of course, he's got $36 million to spend, and he's making stuff up left and right, and he's issuing bribes. And so, you know, there's a lot of forces arrayed against us, but that's been true from the beginning, and we've cleared every hurdle up to this point. You know, and everyone said that the recall would never qualify, and we got more signatures than any signature drive in United States history. I'm pretty excited. I've been, you know, the representative for this area in the legislature for almost 5 years now, and I've tried to fight it every way I can to, you know, turn things around in our capital and to fight back against the supermajority and the corruption that really is so central to the way our state government works. And in the last 16 months in particular, that battle has taken on a whole new pitch, as it's been against Gavin Newsom and his one-man rule. And of course, we have the lawsuit, and I've tried to get the legislature to step up and do something, and I've introduced multiple resolutions to terminate the emergency. And we took, you know, I wrote a resolution called the Healthy Communities Resolution to protest the lockdowns, got it passed. There are 12 county boards of supervisors. But this whole time, kind of in the background, the recall movement was humming along and gathering steam. And, you know, so it was the people of California and all of you who were volunteers who were fighting back in the way that now has really mattered most, and has given us a chance to really change things by bringing a whole new element into the equation. And that's the voice of the people directly. So I think that, you know, this is a unique opportunity to really set our state on an entirely different course and a whole new change of direction, to totally change the game of the way politics works here. And it's really close, and there is so much at stake, especially now with the governor hinting he's about to close schools again and everything else. You know, we got to fight like our state's future depends on it, because it really does. So why don't I just pause there, and would love to take the conversation any direction you'd like. Well, I mean, it is very much true that this has created a lot of perverse incentives. And, you know, I think Sandra was just telling you, is Sandra here?
Yeah, right here.
You were saying you're trying to hire people. Are you having trouble getting people to come and work? Yeah, I've heard that from so many. If you go to any meeting of the chambers, everyone will say that is the biggest thing right now is the workforce. You can't get people to come and work. And it's so perversely ironic because, you know, we've also had so much trouble getting unemployment benefits to people who need them. I mean, that is the number one thing by far that my office has been consumed by over the last 16 months, is dealing with the inept EDD, which has, you know, prevented people from getting benefits that they're entitled to, meanwhile sending $31 billion to prisoners who were able to defraud them without breaking a sweat. But then, you know, so we didn't have a social safety net that functioned as it's supposed to be because of the incompetence of this administration and our state's bureaucracy. And by the way, these are people who lost their jobs on the government's orders to begin with. But then you have, you know, now benefits are being provided in a way that is actually making it economically irrational for people to return to work, and is keeping us sort of locked in this pandemic mentality, you know, and is making it so our unemployment is still close to the highest in the country. It's 7.7%. So I would want to just completely break free of that pandemic mentality. Let's, you know, we shouldn't be paying people's rent anymore. We shouldn't be, you know, providing more benefits that people are entitled to under our existing social safety net. We should be providing people the support that they need when it's needed, but we should be creating policy that's designed to get the economy back to full tilt. And because small businesses are just dying. I mean, I'm glad to hear that you're expanding, Sandra, but you know, we know that half of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic have yet to recover. We know that small business openings are down substantially still. I mean, the big companies have been okay for the most part, you know. Walmart never closed. Hollywood was specifically exempted from lockdowns. It's the small businesses who have really paid the price. And so we need to completely retool those incentives to, you know, encourage a return to work and to get the economy back to full capacity. So on the first count, the governor has been running these ridiculous ads, and he's been saying this for months. They call the recall the California coup.
Yeah.
It's literally a vote of the people. They consider that a coup. It shows you the mentality of our political class. They said we're trying to overturn a democratic election. It's like, well, okay, I guess so, with another democratic election. We don't elect people for life in this country. They have said all these, he's always saying it's about these crazy groups that are supposedly behind this. I haven't even heard of most of these groups. He seems very familiar with them for some reason.
Yeah.
When you actually, if you talk to people who are actually on the front lines of this, as I know many of you are, you've probably had Democrats who signed the petition, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And independents, yes, and Bernie-crats.
Libertarians.
Libertarians. Gavin Newsom is the great uniter. He brings everyone together against him. Right? Because his failures are just so fundamental. They go much deeper than partisanship. He gives us something to agree about, and what he's doing is just so bad. So that's on that question. Now, the other point you raise is really crucial. How do we make sure this never happens again? One answer to it is what we were just talking about with our lawsuit. So James Gallagher and I took Gavin Newsom to court and sued him for abusing his emergency powers. He claims that a state of emergency turns him into a dictator in the ancient Roman mold, where he can actually just become a one-person government and rule by fiat. I'm not making this up. This is literally what he argued in court. And so we have said, no, actually, we still have a constitution, even during an emergency. Our founding fathers were pretty familiar with what emergencies were. They had just been through a revolution and a war, and yet they created a constitution that enshrines a separation of powers, because James Madison said that combining all powers in one hand is the very definition of tyranny. And so the case is now hopefully headed to the California Supreme Court, and it may be too late to fully rein in this governor and erase the damage that he's done, but at least there'll be a precedent of never again will we have one-man rule. Never again will we allow one person to usurp the authority, not just of the legislature, but of the millions of citizens of the state. And I think that, as an extension of that, I think the recall is going to send an even more powerful message than perhaps any legal precedent could, by saying that, if anyone tries to do anything like this again, the people know how to respond, and there's going to be a price to pay. And I've said that, if I'm elected, I think the most important job of our next governor is to make it less important who the governor is, by returning power to local communities and their citizens. That's the way our country is supposed to work. But I saw as early as last May what was happening, and that we needed to remove his emergency powers because he was using them for reasons that weren't even really related to the pandemic. And he himself said he was going to do that. If you heard this statement on April 1st of 2020, very beginning of all this, he said he saw COVID-19 as an opportunity for a new progressive era. That's what he said. And he has, used extraordinary emergency powers for personal political gain. I think that is the overarching argument for the recall, is this is an abuse of the public trust that he had never seen. He saw the pandemic, he used it to claim absolute powers, and then he used that for political purpose and to reward his special interest benefactors like the teachers unions and many others. I wish that our legislature would pass that law, because at least what then it would do is that an emergency would expire unless the legislature acted to extend it. And so, would our legislature have proactively decided to keep extending the emergency? Maybe not. I mean, it's sort of, basically useless. And so, it may have just sort of let the status quo be what it is. But at least that kind of puts the burden on the legislature to take a proactive step if you want the emergency to continue.
Will it be, can it be like a permanent, this is only 60 days, legislation or government cannot continue this? Just solve it like put it in the Constitution of California, any emergency should only last this amount of time. And if you cannot figure it out, well, we the people will figure it out somehow. Because, like you said, if the legislation keeps just like, oh, well, we're going to extend another 60 days,
Right.
Like you say, it becomes something where you can get useless.
Well, I mean, I think that certainly could be done. That would take a voter initiative. I mean, but I'll also add that the Emergency Services Act has a lot of problems, and it does need to be reformed. But it is not. It doesn't actually allow what Gavin Newsom has claimed that it allows. He has said that it provides him unlimited authority to create law and rule the state by dictate, which is not something that any law can give a governor the power to do, because that violates the separation of powers in our Constitution. So, I mean, there are some forms of emergency powers that are legitimate. Like, for example, medfly infestations have been declared a state of emergency several times in California history, and the act has been used to sort of, get the agencies like the Agriculture Department to have a more muscular response in dealing with the medfly infestation. And that's a legitimate use of emergency powers, perhaps. You can sort of skip over some of the red tape in order to respond to a pressing threat. And there's, some ways in which even those sort of powers might be legitimate for like an earthquake or a hurricane or something like that, to allow for a speedy response to a very temporary threat. But having a, kind of unlimited lawmaking for an indefinite period of time is something that the framers of that law certainly never envisioned, something our Constitution certainly doesn't allow.
Question back here.
Yes.
It's me.
Here, I can sort of go
That's
here.
right. So I'll raise my voice a little
Facing
bit.
everyone.
We're having a tough time hearing back here, but just wanted to ask you if you have any opinions you can share regarding the alleged or actual voter fraud that occurred, not only nationwide, but specifically here in California in November 2020, and how that might apply to the upcoming election and future elections in California. What kind of confidence can we have and should we have in the electoral process?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at what has been happening in plain sight, I think that, there's reason for skepticism, because Gavin Newsom and the legislature have been openly cheating people. They changed the law on the eve of the vote just a couple weeks ago in order to move the election to a date when he thought he'd have a better chance of winning. I mean, it's crazy that this actually happened. I gave a speech on the floor of the assembly. I said every child knows the word for changing the rules in the middle of the game. It's cheating. Right? And then they did all mail ballots as well, specifically for this recall. So when they cheat in plain sight, and then they wonder why people are, suspicious about what goes on behind closed doors. I will say, with respect to those issues, if you're familiar with Election Integrity Project, they are kind of on the leading edge of trying to look into all this. They're filing lawsuits against county registrars, looking to clean up voter rolls. They're recruiting poll watchers. If you know who Rick Cornell is, he just started a group called Fix California that's doing a lot of the same thing. So if it's an issue that concerns you, I would recommend checking out their work, and there are ways to get involved. But I'd also say if you have any doubts about all of this for the recall, that's just all the more reason we need to work that much harder to make sure we win by a lot.
Good answer.
Okay.
Another question.
Yeah.
Somebody asked that crime and homelessness. What's your idea of those two issues? And they're different, but they're kind of entwined.
Yeah, they're definitely entwined, and they're both huge problems. Where California is, in so many other ways, we're a national outlier in all the wrong ways. I mean, homelessness has been actually improving generally across the United States for the last few years, but in California, it's continued to go up dramatically. In fact, the unsheltered homeless population in California is larger than any state's, not by a little bit, not twice as big, not 3 times, 9 times as big as the next closest state. So vastly disproportionate to our population. And this is despite the fact that we have continued to throw billions and billions and billions of dollars more at the problem. I actually requested an audit of all homelessness spending last February, and Gavin Newsom intervened to kill the audit, his administration. His own mental health czar, his top mental health advisor, had said in an interview in March of this year that with homelessness, it's not a money problem, it's a leadership problem. It's the governor's own top mental health advisor, and he even added, for further clarity, that it's a problem of leadership at the state level. Despite that, just a couple months later, Newsom Newsom and the legislature allocate $12 billion more this year for homelessness spending. Even the nonpartisan legislative analyst has said this money is not going to make an impact. Their words were it's going to quickly dissipate because there's no strategy. So I would, heed the advice of the legislative analyst and have a strategy. I would heed the advice of the governor's own mental health advisor and have new leadership, which in short means that it's not brain surgery. You look to what works and has worked in other states. You need to have a shelter, a roof over the head of people, and a place for them to go. You can't have people living and dying, languishing on the streets, causing our communities to deteriorate. And then once they do have a roof over their heads, you need to have the needed services available that they can be connected with, whether that's mental health services, whether it's substance abuse treatment, whether it's job training. The sort of evidence-based services that have been shown to give people the best chance of transitioning out of homelessness and turning their lives around. Now, as you rightly mentioned, there's also a nexus with crime in several ways, because we've had this policy of releasing a lot of people from prison early and decriminalizing a lot of quite serious offenses, which of course leads to people being put back out on the streets with nowhere to go.
And defunding the police.
And exactly, and disrespecting our law enforcement as well. So I actually, when I first ran for the assembly in 2016, this was maybe my biggest issue because I worked as a prosecutor, and I saw how recent changes were causing a big spike in certain types of crimes. As one example, Prop 47, if you're familiar with this allows someone to steal up to $950 in merchandise with essentially no consequence, or to shoot up on the streets with essentially no consequence. It's taken 5 more years and a pending recall for Gavin Newsom to finally notice the problem. Just last week, he held a press conference finally saying that retail theft has become an issue as a state. So I would seek to roll back a lot of those changes. The ones that Gavin Newsom has done using executive authority, like he recently made, I believe it was 82,000 serious offenders eligible for early release, I immediately roll those things back.
I have a question. With the amount that the recall is costing us, which is disturbing all on its own, when we have 46 candidates running, I adore you. I would love for you to win. And how do we ensure that? Or is there going to come down to some point where you all as a Republican Party are going to get together and pick a winner or something, so that we don't end up spending all of this taxpayer dollar and then come to a standpoint where it's too spread out?
Right. Well, I'll answer your question about the party first. There's a process going on right now for who's going to get the party's official endorsement. And so there's 1,200 or something delegates to the state party, and the rules set forward were that if you get the endorsement of 200 delegates, then you're eligible for the party's endorsement. And so the deadline to get the delegates to nominate you is this Saturday. And so I've got well over the 200 by this point, and 2 other candidates over 200. So it looks like 3 of us are going to be eligible for the endorsement. Thanks very much. So that process is going to play out in a virtual convention on August 6th. They've set the threshold at 60%. So in order for anyone to get the endorsement, someone has to get 60% of the votes of all the delegates there. So it's quite possible that no one will get it. But whether or not the party endorses someone, ultimately this is going to be decided by the voters. It wasn't the party that started the recall. The party's gotten involved, it's been helpful, but it's the people of California who decided the recall. So as to your concern about splitting the vote, I hear this a lot from people, but I'm not really that concerned about it, because number one, there's really only a few of us who are probably going to get any significant share of the votes. Number two, with a recall, it's different than a regular election because there are 2 questions on the ballot. The first question is, do you want to recall Gavin Newsom? Yes or no? That's the easy one, right? And then the second one, of course, is which candidate do you want to replace him? And I think that actually, to some extent, having multiple good candidates who are appealing to different types of voters, who have different messages, who can bring different people into the fold, that's helpful in increasing voter turnout on the first question. And so what I've said is that all of us on the candidates, we're all on the same team. We're all on the same team. My only opponent is Gavin Newsom. I'm going to aim all of my fire at Gavin Newsom. And I happen to think whoever draws that contrast best, whoever shows they'll be the polar opposite of him and lead us in a totally different direction, that'll be the person who rises to the top of the second question. And And it's also worth noting that Newsom's sort of team and attack dogs were successful in scaring any serious Democrat from filing. So you would just have like 9 no-name Democrats, so the odds that any one of them is going to sort of consolidate a significant share of the vote is pretty low. So I think that, things are shaping up in a way that's okay. If for some reason something weird starts to happen and it looks like there's going to be maybe a really problematic outcome, then of course, thoughtful people can try to come to a plan of action, but I don't think we're at that point. I'm the only legislator who is declined all funding from the third house. I decided that I saw that it was ruining our state, that it's corrupted our politics, and so I said I'm going to be, the first totally citizen-funded elected official at the state level in California. And that's why I'm running this campaign, and that's, I think, the change in our political culture that we need. I'm going to try to get other people to do that. Regardless of party, I'm going to say, that we should have more people who say I'm not going to participate in this corrupt system anymore. But ultimately, one of the first things I would do if I was elected is I'd call a special session of the legislature and demand action on all these issues we're talking about: education reform and school choice, homelessness, crime, the cost of living. And if the legislature refuses and decides to just, continue to play the same game and remains mired in this era of corruption, then I take the issue to voters again in 2022 and say, look, you can suffer the same fate as Gavin Newsom. You want to continue to be subservient to the teachers union and others. You've been waiting patiently. Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for stepping up and playing a different game.
Absolutely.
That's been really refreshing. My question. Hi, first of all, Justin and Jackie. We're from up in Loomis, and
Yes, good to see you guys. Thank you for being here.
So we've got young kids, not quite school age yet, but with those teachers unions flirting with demanding shutdowns again and masking and things. One of the things that comes to mind for me, one of the unintended consequences of them pushing for that is demand for private schools, homeschooling, school choice. I think all that's great, and that's probably the direction we want to send our kids. And obviously you want the best for California public schools, but with their unintended consequence of driving demand for those private schools and homeschools, what do you think the future is in terms of fighting for the right to homeschool, right to private school? Do you think that we can feel secure in that as Californians wanting to do that for our kids? What would your bet be for the future of private schooling, homeschooling, that type of thing?
Well, I think a lot of that hinges on the recall. I mean, there's no doubt that, right now there is a full-on war on charter schools. This really has been kind of building for some time, but at least with Jerry Brown, you had someone who had at least some respect for the importance of school choice, even though he certainly had his ties to the unions as well and did a lot of bad things, and I disagreed with him on most things. He at least was a little bit of a break on some of this, but once the teachers unions got Gavin Newsom and they got their guy there, it was just open season. And so, his first year in office, he signed some of the worst anti-charter school bills we've ever seen. They were condemned by civil rights groups like the NAACP and the Urban League. And then during COVID-19, in the very early stages of this, with schools shut down, a lot of families were turning to charters, and independent study-based charters in particular, that had developed models of distance learning that were effective. Thank you. Because the districts were not offering good options, and so families were disenrolling their kids from the districts and enrolling them in these charters. And so what did the legislature and Newsom do? They specifically passed a bill to stop this and keep kids trapped in their district school, which was not open and wasn't even really offering any meaningful form of distance learning, by passing a bill saying we're going to deny you funding for any new student. This prompted a lawsuit from a number of charter schools, and then it's just continued. So this year you had a bill called AB 1316 that would have basically been the death knell for the independent study sector of the broader charter school sector. And we were able to defeat that, fortunately, but some form of it did end up getting through in the budget. And yes, there have been attempts to go after even private home schools as well. A few years ago, there was a bill targeting them in all of these kind of ridiculous ways, saying we're going to have this big oversight body that would be responsible for overseeing whatever that might entail. We're going to do fire inspections for homeschools, so they have to come in and, I mean, just any way to entangle government into the lives of people who have specifically chosen homeschooling to avoid having the government involved in their kids' education. What I'm getting behind because what we've seen during, in response to COVID in other states is it's actually catalyzed this revolution in school choice. You see a lot of other states pursuing things like education savings accounts, whereas in California we've had this, just the opposite, we've had this retrenchment. So I'm getting behind a school choice initiative for the 2022 ballot, which will allow funding to follow the child, so that you'll get most of the per pupil funding allocated to your child to take and spend as you see fit, whether that's on qualified homeschooling expenses, whether it's on private school tuition, whatever the case may be. And I think that there's going to be a lot, in fact we see it in the polling now, there's a lot of support for that idea, and I think it would also put a lot of pressure on the legislature to try to do something, because we'll have this waiting in the wings.
So along those lines of CARB and code enforcement, rule enforcement, can you speak a little bit to possibly getting in and working to roll back cap and trade? What are your thoughts on that? Do you like it? Do you not like it? I'm looking at, you look at that and look at the electrification in California and phasing out of gas, and then we have rolling blackouts and power alerts and things like that. So what are your thoughts on that whole thing? Do you think it was overstepping? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I voted against cap and trade. I was in the legislature when that was reauthorized.
It's a weird cottage industry that redirects money to LA.
Well, that's right. Was sold to us as some sort of big environmental thing. It was actually quite odd when this passed. All of the environmental groups were against it, strangely enough.
Because there's an economic factor.
Yeah, but what cap and trade does is it's raised the cost of living by a lot, and it's basically just created this off-budget slush fund for the legislature to spend. And so that results in billions and billions of dollars to divvy up, as the legislature, the governor want. And the biggest line item for the cap and trade funds, the one that is constant is high-speed rail, which, by the way, is a net polluter. So much for being pro-environment. But that is really what is even keeping the high-speed rail even having a semblance of financial viability. Is it gets a automatic earmark. I think it's something like 25% of cap and trade funds goes to high-speed rail.
Yeah,
so
Chevron and all the different refineries in the Bay Area, all the refineries in LA are paying for it.
What's your view on the death penalty, specifically on lethal injection? Because like I said, I'm a nurse, I know what actually goes on. It's not injection, it's IV, it's three medications.
it's what?
What's your view on the death penalty, specifically lethal injection?
Well, the death penalty is something that the voters decided to a few years ago. And it was actually in, I believe it was 2016.
Yes.
The voters passed an initiative saying that we're going to keep the death penalty and we're actually going to reform it to make it more efficient. Well, it's not a great way of putting it, but to make it so it actually exists, because there hadn't even been a single execution in many, many years. And so they said, well, we're going to make the process so it doesn't take forever. And Gavin Newsom, when he was running for governor in 2018, he promised, I'm going to respect the will of the electorate on that issue.
Right.
Those were his exact words. What's one of the first things he does when he gets to office? He goes back on it and unilaterally reverses the death penalty. So it's an example. Jerry Brown was against the death penalty. He didn't like it, but he realized he didn't have the power to unilaterally get rid of it. But for Gavin Newsom, that just made no difference. And in fact, he made it into this big publicity thing. He released this footage of the death chambers being, deconstructed in San Quentin, and it was this was before COVID, but it was a preview of what would happen, over these last 16 months, where, he just sort of feels like he can do whatever he wants.
Because I walked by the gas chamber, it used to be, gas, and then it was hanging or something, but again, I saw death roommates, and they were there, they're aging, they've got arthritis or something. I'm a nurse, like I said, I know what goes into it, I know what the medications were. I'm just asking a question, is it a good idea, should the voters, I think in Texas they actually allow it. I mean, each state has their own views, and in Europe they have their own views. But again, I'm just curious, what happens? Where do again, digressing from that, where do the inmates that were released? Where do they go? I mean, do they commit crimes again? Where do they go? They were released.
Well, the answer is yes, they do. We know that,
Yeah.
that a lot commit crimes again. We've talked about this before. We know that it's linked to homelessness.
Yeah.
And we know that it's tragic for many of the offenders themselves who could turn around their lives and lead productive lives
Yeah.
if only they were given the help that they need. But, let's take one example of Proposition 47, which decriminalized essentially drug use or made it so it couldn't be charged as a felony. What has resulted is that you no longer have the ability to give people treatment, because the only way you could sort of convince them to sign up for treatment is if you offered it as an alternative to being convicted of a felony. But if you can no longer convict them of a felony, then they have no reason to actually sign up for the treatment. And so the drug court system, which had actually been really effective in helping people get rehabilitated, has been eviscerated following Prop 47. So it's like we've somehow managed to just undermine both public safety and rehabilitation and harm the safety of our communities while also harming the well-being of offenders themselves. Yes. Oh.
Yeah, I have a question. Isn't California really broke? I mean, he says we're in a surplus and he can afford to give away all these sweepstakes monies for taking a vaccine or raffles, and it just seems that he has an endless amount of money for whatever little thing he wants to do. All the masks, that mask debacle with China at the beginning of the pandemic, how does
takes
he
money from the police department and all these other.
Yes.
For all the testing.
Well, that is a big part of it. Yeah. In fact, Jerry Brown just said, back to our good friend Jerry Brown, he said that this year's budget was artificially pumped up. And he also said that we need to have a more frugal, prudent, and sustainable approach. Jerry Brown is saying that.
When he says that.
You've really gone off the deep end. So yes, as to the surplus, Newsom comes out a couple months ago and says, we got an $80 billion surplus. I'm doing such a great job. So yes, a few things on that. Firstly, it was just a couple days later that the nonpartisan legislative analyst came out and said, no, it's actually half that. Secondly, yes, a lot of it was a result of this influx of federal funds. Thirdly, we had supposedly had this tens of billions of dollar deficit the year before. That's just sort of the perversity of California's tax system, is that we have this yo-yo in revenue streams. And so when the stock market does well, which it did this last year, that just leads to higher revenues. It doesn't reflect good governance in any way, shape, or form. But fourth, to your point, the state is broke. You only have a surplus if you ignore the hundreds of billions of dollars in off-the-book liabilities. So, we could all be doing great. You could be, I'm sure you would, your profits will look a lot better if you could just sort of ignore it.
Just move everything over.
Yeah, exactly. Just take it off the books. So, it's just crazy that this is then used to, justify a $267 billion budget. It wasn't that long ago.
That is mandatory spending. The increasing mandatory spending, because we're stuck for that forever.
Right.
If in my house, if I don't have the money in the bank, I don't like the check.
Right. Well, it's kind of complicated because there's a lot of arcane rules as to what is mandatory and what is not. But the fact is that we still, we're actually borrowing some, even as part of all of that. And the state budget, a little over 10 years ago, was just slightly over $100 billion. So it's now $267 billion, and you look around and say, oh wow, but look at what we've gotten in return. These great roads, beautiful dams and aquifers, great high-speed rail train that's getting us north to south in an hour. No, of course not. Nothing has improved. The quality of life has only continued to deteriorate.
Our reservoir system is great.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing, is we keep spending more and more and getting less and less. We sacrifice the most and we get the least return. So my approach is, let's get back to basics. Okay, let's pave our roads, let's store our water, let's manage our forests, maintain our grid, fund our police, do the things government is supposed to do them well, and do nothing else. Right now it's just the opposite. We neglect the things government is supposed to do and do a lot of stuff that people could really do without.
What is your position on the mandating of vaccine?
I'm 100% against it.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I also introduced a bill to ban vaccine passports, but they refused to pass that one.
Can we quote you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, yes.